You're saving. Maybe not 20%, but you're saving something. So why does it still feel like you're falling behind? Here's the uncomfortable answer. The 20% rule was never derived from research. There is no peer-reviewed paper behind it. It's a heuristic that got repeated until it became gospel. And for most income levels, it's either too low, too high, or just wrong in ways the data makes very clear. Research on actual wealth outcomes across large populations tells a more specific and more useful story. The optimal savings rate is not a fixed number. It depends on your income bracket, your age, and your timeline. And when you apply the data correctly, the answer looks very different from what the gurus tell you. Today we're going through the data, income bracket by income bracket, decade by decade, to find the savings rate that the research actually supports, not the one that got repeated until it felt like fact. The 20% rule appears in early personal finance literature as part of broader budgeting heuristics. It was adopted widely not because studies confirmed it as optimal, but because it was simple, memorable, and felt ambitious without being impossible. A good heuristic is not the same as an optimal strategy. The rule doesn't account for income, and income is the primary variable. Someone earning $40,000 a year, saving 20%, saves $8,000 annually. Someone earning $140,000 saves $28,000. Same percentage. Entirely different wealth outcomes, tax treatment, and compounding potential. One rule cannot optimize for both, and pretending it does is what leaves people either undersaving or burning out trying to hit a number that was never calibrated to them. I find it genuinely frustrating when I look at how widely this rule gets cited without that context. The 20% rule doesn't fail because people don't try hard enough. It fails because it was never designed for the range of situations it gets applied to. The most consistent finding in long-term savings data is not that higher rates produce better outcomes. It's that sustained rates do. A 15% savings rate maintained for 20 years will outperform a 30% rate abandoned after 18 months. The research on savings behavior shows this repeatedly across income brackets. Overly aggressive targets produce worse long-term results than sustainable ones. When researchers and institutions analyze large populations of savers over long periods, tracking actual savings rates against actual wealth accumulation, what emerges is not a single optimal number. It's a range that shifts based on income level, age at which saving began, and consistency of contributions. Vanguard's 2025 data on retirement savings behavior makes the mechanism clear. Participants enrolled in automatic contribution plans saved 20 to 30% more after 3 years than those managing contributions manually. The consistency that automation creates is more predictive of long-term wealth outcomes than the rate itself. This is what the research means when it says sustained rates beat aggressive ones. For lower income earners, the research does not support pushing toward 20%. The data shows that a 10 to 15% rate, sustained consistently, produces significantly stronger long-term outcomes than a higher rate that gets abandoned after 6 months because it compressed spending below a sustainable level. The enemy at this income level is not the savings rate, it's abandonment. For middle-income earners, something closer to the traditional recommendation holds, but only once debt is managed to a sustainable level. Households carrying high-cost debt alongside a 20% savings rate are often saving in low-yield accounts while paying 18% interest on credit cards. That is not a saving strategy. That is a mathematical error that the 20% rule never addresses. For higher income earners, 20% is arguably the most damaging recommendation, not because it's too hard, but because it's too easy. Research on high net worth household accumulation consistently shows that the households who reach meaningful wealth milestones in their 40s and 50s had savings rates significantly above 20% during their peak earning years. The data point I keep returning to is this. The top quartile of wealth accumulators in their income bracket consistently saved at rates that felt uncomfortable at the time they set them. Not impossible, uncomfortable. That gap between comfortable and uncomfortable is where the compounding difference lives. The research also identifies a ceiling effect. Beyond a certain savings rate, additional contributions produce diminishing returns. Not because the money stops compounding, but because consumption compression below a threshold increases financial stress, reduces productivity in measurable ways, and leads to savings abandonment. Studies on extreme savings behavior, people pursuing financial independence at savings rates above 50%, consistently show high abandonment rates within 3 years. A savings rate that is sustainable over decades will produce better outcomes than an optimal rate that lasts 18 months. The research doesn't romanticize extreme frugality. The data on long-term adherence is sobering. In your 20s, the research does not support prioritizing savings rate above debt elimination and emergency fund establishment. The compounding advantage of starting early is real, but a 10% rate at 25 maintained consistently outperforms a 25% rate started at 35. The priority is building the system, not hitting a specific percentage. Your 30s are where the data becomes urgent. Income typically peaks its growth curve in this decade. Compounding has the most time left to run, and the gap between 15% and 25% saved in your 30s is not linear. It's exponential by the time both reach retirement age. Most people who hear that the 30s are the critical decade respond the same way. They plan to save more when things settle down, when the mortgage is paid down, when the kids are in school. The research on actual savings behavior over time shows that when things settle down is not a financial plan. It's a delay mechanism that the data consistently exposes as the single most expensive decision analytical people make. The wealth gap between someone who optimizes in their 30s versus someone who waits until their 40s at identical income levels is not small. The compounding mathematics are the most aggressive argument for acting in this decade that exists in the financial literature. By your 40s, if you've maintained consistent savings through your 30s, the research on retirement outcomes shows the priority shifts. The absolute savings rate matters less than asset allocation, tax efficiency, and understanding sequence of returns risk. The danger that poor market returns early in retirement can permanently damage a portfolio that a higher savings rate in your 40s alone cannot fix. What the data actually supports is not a fixed percentage, but a dynamic framework. A baseline savings rate you can genuinely sustain now, and a pre-committed mechanism to increase it as income grows. Specifically, directing a fixed percentage of every income increase to savings before the lifestyle adjustment happens. The Save More Tomorrow program, studied across thousands of employees, produced average savings rate increases of nearly 4 times the starting rate over roughly 40 months, without participants reporting any reduction in take-home satisfaction. The mechanism works precisely because it bypasses present bias. You never feel the loss because you never adjusted to the income in the first place. The practical framework, built from the research, establish a baseline savings rate you can sustain, 10 to 15% for most people in their 20s. Then pre-commit, in writing or automated in your financial system, to directing 50% of every income increase to savings or investment before lifestyle adjusts. The key word is pre-commit, not reconsider each time. The commitment architecture is the entire mechanism. When I think about the viewers in this audience who have good incomes and still feel behind, this is almost always the missing piece. Not the savings rate today, the absence of any commitment to what happens to tomorrow's income. To close, the 20% rule is not wrong in the way that most bad financial advice is wrong. It's a reasonable starting approximation. The problem is that it gets presented as a fixed law, when the research shows it's a rough heuristic that breaks down at both ends of the income spectrum and across different life stages. The research-backed version of a savings rate is not a number, it's a framework, a sustainable baseline adjusted to your income level and debt situation, an automatic increase mechanism tied to income growth, and a pre-commitment architecture that removes the reevaluation from the moment of temptation. The 20% rule gives everyone the same answer. The research gives you a different answer depending on where you are. That's a more useful thing to know. What percentage of your income do you currently save? Drop the number in the comments, and tell me your income bracket if you're comfortable. I'm going to map where the Finance Deciphered audience sits against the research benchmarks and report back.